Oh sure, just start the video. I mean, what's my motivation? Hi there, thanks for being here today. I'm excited to spend some time with you and with our old friend Kenneth Burke. We've talked about some of his work on the show before. He was, after all, just about the biggest name in 20th century rhetoric, but today we'll be taking a peek at one of his most significant books, A Grammar of Motives. Burke was an autodidact. That is, instead of formal schooling, he read voraciously. As a result, his writing can sometimes lack the structure and organization that get reinforced in school. And that means that his work can sometimes feel disorienting if you're expecting more traditional academic writing, because that's just not what Burke delivers. But his writing is full of interesting and useful insights that have helped me to change the way that I think about writing and rhetoric, even if he's sometimes left me scratching my head. But, as one of my former teachers mercifully put it, when you're reading Burke, get what you can from it and don't worry too much about the rest. You can, after all, always pick it up again later. And that's actually a great expression of what I hope to accomplish with this series on Burke's Grammar of Motives. That is, rather than going page by page and line by line, I want to focus on key concepts and talk about their possible applications in our writing. These videos should help you to have somewhere to plant your feet if you'll end up reading Burke, but really they're about helping you to refine your rhetorical understanding and writing skills. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the book itself, and then wrap up by getting to know Kenneth Burke's infamous Pentad. The introduction to A Grammar of Motives begins with a declaration of the book's purpose. What is involved when we say what people are doing and why they are doing it? An answer to that question is the subject of this book. An understanding of why people do what they do was central to Burke's project. That is, he wanted to understand what motivated people to action, and he wanted to be able to describe the various influences that contribute to those motives. And that's why this book has the somewhat odd title, A Grammar of Motives. Now, we've talked about grammar on the show before, so if you've seen those videos, you'll know that the grammar of a language is a description of the patterns that describe what words can go in what order when speakers make up sentences. So a grammar will account for different types of words like nouns, verbs, and modifiers, and it will also describe the possible combinations of those words, like how subjects come before verbs except in some kinds of questions. If you're studying a language then, and you're trying to understand how a particular sentence came to be, a good understanding of grammar can tell you why that sentence exists in the way that it does. And Burke's Grammar of Motives fills a similar purpose. It's just that instead of understanding why a sentence is the way it is, Burke's grammar aims at understanding why someone did something in the way that they did. As a result, like any other grammar, Burke's Grammar of Motives includes a description of different types of motivating factors, kind of like parts of speech, as well as explanations of how those different factors work together to produce a particular outcome. Also, like true grammars of language, it's worth pointing out that Burke's Grammar of Motives does not say anything about how people should behave. Instead, it only offers insights into why people do what they do. Its objective is understanding, not control. With all of that in mind then, let's talk about the motivational equivalents to the parts of speech. Yes, that's right, it's Pentad time. Once again, in the introduction to the book, Burke writes, any complete statement about motives will offer some kind of answer to these 5 questions. What was done? When or where was it done? Who did it? How he did it? And why? Here he outlines the 5 main components of his grammar, so if you want to understand a particular motive, he argues, you need to understand how these 5 items are working together in a particular situation. Now, it's worth knowing too that KB spent a lot of time in the theater, so these 5 elements, his Pentad, are all derived from drama. This is also why you'll often hear Burke's strategy for rhetorical criticism called dramatism. So let's step onto the stage together to get a better sense of what the terms of Burke's Pentad mean for our understanding of rhetorical situations. Obviously, there's no play without some kind of a stage or set. This is what Burke calls scene. When you're paying attention to scene, you're interested in understanding the qualities of the setting and the influence that they have on the action that unfolds. And that's really pretty reasonable. You would expect different stories to unfold on a set designed like outer space and a set designed like the Wild West. Next, a play has actors, characters who populate the scene and do things. To describe these active players, Burke uses the term agent, and obviously different people do different things. It's important to understand a character's character to understand that character's motive. Of course, actors do things, and the things they do are called acts. We don't need to overthink it though. When Burke asks us to consider what was done, that's literally all we have to do. Describe what was done, whether it was an attack on a space station or a showdown near the old saloon. Now, in order to do things, agents or actors need the ability to act, or the capacity to do things. This is called agency, and different characters will have different capacities for action. For example, a character with magical powers has agency that other characters might lack. They're capable of doing things through magic that can't be done without it. Similarly, someone with a horse has the capacity to go places faster than someone without one. A king has the agency to throw people in the dungeon, and so on. Agency is important because it can enable or constrain certain actions. Knowing what someone is capable of is key to understanding the actions that they might ultimately take. And finally, a complete understanding of motive requires an understanding of the agent's purpose, providing an answer to the question, why did they do what they did? Purpose matters, especially, for example, if a character does something that appears to be pretty awful, and then says, wait, I can explain. In a case like that, the character hopes that an understanding of why they did what they did will lead others to believe that the action was good, or at least done with good intentions, in order to avoid some kind of punishment or scorn. These 5 terms do a good job of describing a character's motives in a play, but Burke argues that the same thing is happening in real life. For him, this isn't just a useful analogy, it's how the world actually works. So great, you may be saying, old KB made up this 5-part way of describing people's motives and it's all based on drama, but how does that help me with my writing? Well, I thought you'd never ask. While Burke's Pentad has its primary application in rhetorical criticism, I think it's also useful for writers because it can help us to understand our audiences more completely so that we can then persuade them more effectively. So, of course, you can try to get to know your audience as agents. Who are they and what are they like? Obviously, it's going to be much easier to write to an audience that you know than to one that you don't. Then you can think in terms of acts. If you're going to persuade your audience, it's probably because you think that whatever acts they're doing now aren't optimal. So what are they? And then, what are you going to propose that they do instead? You'll also want to be mindful of their agency or their capacity to act. For example, I often see arguments that call on an audience to spend large amounts of money to solve a problem without ever really talking about where that money will come from. So if your audience has a limited budget, you'll want to be mindful of the constraints on their agency as you formulate your proposal. You can consider the influence of the scene as well. How are the physical circumstances of the setting influencing your audience? How will it influence your proposal? For example, convincing an audience to use less air conditioning will be much easier in a cooler climate than a hotter one, so being aware of the constraints of scene can go a long way. And finally, your argument can be much more persuasive if you're thinking about your audience's purposes. What reasons do they have for doing things? What reasons can you give them for doing something different? What are they ultimately trying to accomplish, and how can your proposal get them closer to that ultimate goal? If we think of persuasion as a process of modifying our audience's motives, then it's easy to see how the grammar of motives can help us to accomplish that task. If you understand your reader's motives and then you present an argument that either aligns with or refines those motives, then you're going to have a much higher chance of persuading them successfully. Or if you find yourself at odds with someone and cooperation seems impossible, then the tools of the Pentad can help you to really understand where they're coming from so that you can take more productive steps towards a resolution instead of just talking past each other. And you know, maybe it's just me, but I think that's pretty neat. So Burke's opening argument is that if we want to understand what people are doing and why they are doing it, the 5 terms of the Pentad can help us to get to that understanding. And like we talked about at the beginning, these 5 terms work kind of like the parts of speech in a traditional grammar. Just as the parts of speech help us to understand the components of sentences, the 5 terms of the Pentad help us to understand the components of motives. Of course, parts of speech by themselves do not make up a grammar. For that, you'll also need a description of how those parts of speech fit together to form complete sentences. And Burke's grammar has a similar mechanism for describing how the different elements of the Pentad work together to generate motives. He calls the relationship between 2 terms in the Pentad ratios, and that will be the topic of our next video in the series. So if you had as much fun as I did and you don't want to miss out on all that upcoming ratios talk, I hope you'll subscribe and even give this video a like. And while you're taking care of that, I'll just say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.